What's up? What's up? What's up, guys? Welcome to my channel. This is Najwa. Welcome to my channel. If you're new here, please do me a favor. Hit the like and subscribe button. Hit that bell. That way you know whenever I post a video. That really helps out my little channel. If you are new to this channel and you would like to support me, you can also donate to my PayPal. It's here on the screen, but no pressure. So let's chat about this Supreme Court ruling on affirmative action, Clarence Thomas, all of it. I'm basically heartbroken. I don't know any other way that I can describe it. And you know what? Clarence Thomas, there's a lot of speculation and people out there who talk and say, you know what? This guy is like the epitome of like Black self-hate. It's like insidious Black self-hate. There was this Key and Peele episode some time back, and they did a little bit about like Black Republican men. And it was like set in some sort of like townhouse meeting almost, where like it was a bunch of Black Republican men meeting. And each one was wearing the same thing and they were all saying the same thing. And it was really funny. You should check it out if you can. But I'm definitely getting those vibes. And there's a lot of people who actually say that they call Clarence Thomas Justice Harlan Crow, or whatever the guy is, who's his like rich backer, rich donor, or whatever. And you know how those things work. I mean, the guy is from the South. He's from the same state that I grew up in Georgia. And it just, we're going to talk about this. We're going to talk about Clarence Thomas. We're going to talk about the ruling. We're going to talk about the history of affirmative action. We're going to talk about why it's so important. But I just feel like, as a person of color, as an American, as a woman, as someone who grew up in the American South, I just got to get my truth out there. This is like setting time back so far, you know, and basically pretty much everything that we've seen. And you guys feel free to put it in chats if you're having any thoughts, if you want to send any prayers up, if you want to do anything like, you know, express some social justice objectives that you have, feel free to put them in chat. If you're watching after, put it in the comments. But I mean, as someone who grew up in the American South, a woman, a Black person, a person of color, you know, I'm a millennial. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in the late 90s. And I just feel like in the late 90s, the early 2000s, all the way up to Obama, we had gotten to a place there where America was really striving to be an anti-racist place. And what we've seen from MAGA Republicans, what we've seen from the Clarence Thomases, you know, of the US from the past few years, and also, you know, the Rhodes guy from the Proud Boys, and, you know, the MAGA extremists and all those guys, we basically just seen, hi, Libby, we've basically seen a huge regression. Hi, Libby, I'm so glad you're here. We've seen like a huge regression, basically. And I just have to put my truth out there about that. You know, I feel like I've talked about this before. I feel like back in the late 90s, we used to say, oh, I'm colorblind. And colorblind was the thing, right? That was the thing to say. And then, you know, now in 2023, it's like, no, we need you to see our color. We need you to see our color. Because if you sit there and say that you don't see color, if you sit there and say that you don't see color, then you're lying to yourself. You know, there is, and I know this just sounds like a rant, but like I said, I got to put my truth out there before we look at some of this stuff. It's like, you look at how the right has really waged this war to try and get rid of the word woke. Okay, take that for example. Trying to get hi, Miss Lakiva. She says, Miss Lakiva says Thomas is just the worst. I will never look at him as a judge. I feel you on that. And you know what? I looked at the pictures of all the different judges on the Supreme Court. What is it, like 6 Republicans and 3 Democrats? First of all, that right there does not represent the landscape of America to me. I know that like MAGA extremists have come to the front lines in the past, you know, decade or whatever that is. But for the most part, I feel like most people in the US are quite progressive. So I don't even think that the Supreme Court, the way that I feel like those people were just plants that were placed by the MAGA Republican type people. But, you know, like when you look back at just where we've come, it's so vital right now to have things like affirmative action, because there are like these insidious, scary underpinning things in place that are trying to undermine civil rights. It's trying to undermine the civil rights movement of the 1960s. It's trying to, oh, thank you so much, Miss Lakiba. Yalibi says Clarence Thomas hates himself and his kind. This man has a special place reserved for him in hell. Oh my God, guys, savage! You guys are so savage. But it's really bizarre to me. It's something that as a Black person, it really hurts me. You look right now on television, you look what's going on the internet, and we're not making stuff up. This is not making stuff up of looking around and seeing everywhere where Black people are being dehumanized the same way they were during the Jim Crow laws of the 1960s, the same way they were during the 17th century and the 18th century with slavery. It's like, we've regressed. You look at the United States of America, and since Donald Trump has come onto the scene, it's like we have regressed. Affirmative action. Lyndon B. Johnson said something really important. He basically said, and we're going to look at exactly what he says later. But he said in an address during a keynote speech at a university where he was like the keynote speaker, he said, not having policies in place like affirmative action for a people, and he was referring to Black people, but of course we know affirmative action can include women, it can include Asians, it can include LGBTQ, it can include veterans, it can include disabled people, and it's important for them as well. But I'm speaking mostly from my perspective as a Black person. And Johnson basically said, not having policies in place like affirmative action is like putting people in a race, and one group of the people in the race had their feet have been shackled, and they've been, chained, and their bodies have been maligned, their bodies have been fatigued and withering away. And you just take those shackles off and you're like, go, run. Imagine if someone had been shackled for 300 years and then you're like, oh, go, run. No, the race is not equal. So policies like affirmative action is what helps us to try to get to a colorblind place. But America is not a colorblind country. Okay. Tell me, Yalibi. Okay, he took away from minorities the same opportunities given to him. I do not know how he sleeps at night. You know what? You are exactly right. And I put some stuff in here where we're going to take a look at with that. The thing is that I'm in an interracial marriage. My husband is white, but when I married my husband, it almost solidified for me more like how I need to advocate for Black people. I don't know why. Maybe it's just the way that I'm made up, but it seems like it had the opposite effect on Clarence Thomas. I don't want to speculate on anybody's marriage or anything, but it seems like he truly is ashamed of where he comes from. He seems ashamed of his background. I was actually reading this article about him, not to go on too much of a tangent. I want to come back to the Supreme Court. I want to look at other people's opinions about this, but I was reading about how he had sort of slandered and smeared his sister's name and said that she was lazy and she was depending on the welfare system. And, she was just a blight on society. And it was like, no, she was living that hard life that a lot of people that look like her and that look like him are living, because of that same thing that Johnson said, that if you take someone's shackles off after they've been on for hundreds of years and you try and say, oh, you're free, and put them in the race, it just don't work like that, baby. It just don't work like that. So it's really bizarre. But with all that being said, let's get into this. So I want to show you guys this article. This is from Jahan Jones, and this is from MSNBC. It is from the Readout blog. And you guys to feel free to put your thoughts in the chat and all that stuff. If you're watching after, put your thoughts in the comments. This is a really good writer. And I really like the way that he expresses basically everything that I'm saying, what he just says it like 15 times more eloquently. So this article is entitled, "The Conservative Justices Want to Kill White Guilt. They Just Might." This is from July 1st, 2023. And like I said, this is by this writer, Jahan Jones. Before we even get into it, let me just say this. You want to kill white guilt. That comes back to this thing. I mean, I talk about this a lot on this channel. white guilt, white privilege, white fragility. You know, a lot of the people who want to push this narrative of, oh, the United States is a colorblind nation, usually it is those people with white guilt, and they don't really know how to juggle it. They don't know what to do with it. It's like, dude, America's still a racist place. You see that from the dehumanizing way that the police treats Black men. You see that from the way that every single day you see more police brutality towards Black men, treating them like they're not even human. You see that from the way that America is 13% Black, but yet when we look at executive leadership, we look at administration, we look at politics, we look at the government, we look at advocacy, we look at Hollywood, and we do not see 13%. You know, we're lucky if we see 3%. That right there tells you America is not an anti-racist. I mean, it's trying to be anti-racist, but it's not a colorblind country, you know? And so I think a lot of people really just, they don't want to, especially people who are fairer skinned, you know, no offense to anybody, but race is something that we need to talk about. And I think that's what a lot of people are unwilling to accept. They're like, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. That was my ancestors. My ancestors didn't even own slave farms. You know, it's just like, dude, will you just, I'm telling that persona of white privilege and white fragility to just like, dude, just please calm down and try and listen to what someone is telling you. White guilt, you know, it can't be something that's killed off with taking out affirmative action and saying, oh, we shouldn't try and hire people based on their colors. No, you should try and hire people based on their background, because some people are far more disadvantaged than others. What about that don't you understand? But anyway, with that being said, oh my goodness, Yulibi. Things are going to come to a civil unrest if they continue on this road. This is one of my biggest concerns. You know, like, I'm American. I was born in America. I moved to Europe about 2017. And, you know, but it's still my home. It's still my home. It's still the place that I call home. I come home to. I visit my family and things like that. And so I still care about the place, you know? And so just to see it, to see what's happening there, it's really disheartening. And what's bad is I feel like America for a very long time has been the front runner of a lot of these conversations. Places in Europe don't have things like, you know, affirmative action. That's where America has really been progressive. That's why John F. Kennedy and Johnson and Obama and people like this are so awesome. That's why we're so revered around the world, because of our focus on, it doesn't matter what your color is. It doesn't matter like what socioeconomic status you come from. You're going to be able to make it here. That being able to be facilitated is because of things like affirmative action. But anyway, so Jahan starts by saying, the intentions of this melancholy country as concerns Black people, and anyone who doubts me can ask any Indian, have always been genocidal. He goes right in. I really like this. I really like this writer. I've read him several times. He writes on the Readout blog a lot, and it's really cool. So he goes on to say, they needed us for labor and for sport. Now they can't get rid of us. Oh, this is James Baldwin. So this is a quote from James Baldwin speaking at the University of California, Berkeley in 1979. After the Supreme Court decision that struck down affirmative action in college admissions and potentially elsewhere too, I have absolution on my mind. He goes on to say, as in the act of absolving oneself from guilt. I once believed this conservative-laden court embodied the white evangelical id. Now, that right there, I do have to comment on this, because I think of myself as a Christian. I call myself a Christian. I'm Catholic. I grew up Muslim, but I'm Christian. And it's just like, I've even talked to here in France to some of my friends from church, you know, and I'm like, I have no idea what's going on with my home country. And they're like, it's because they're like on some other stuff. Like they're on some crazy evangelical stuff. It's like even people in Europe see it. It's like, this is not Christianity. Like, for instance, with the January 6th stuff, a bunch of these people were saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. that is total misinterpretation of scripture. That has absolutely nothing to do with what Jesus would want people to do. I mean, it's like, it makes no sense to me. Oh my gosh. Wow, wow, wow. Yes, Yulibi. Okay, so Yulibi says, I unfortunately have been thinking about moving to Portugal for a while. Things are here are not looking good. So my husband is from Portugal, and Portugal is I really like it. I really like it. I hear you on that. You have a mixed daughter. It's really really hard, I feel like, for mixed race children, and I'm really thankful for my parents, because what's been happening a lot is people are trying to erase black history and whitewash history, and I feel like having my parents to kind of tell me about writers like James Baldwin, talk about Angela Davis, talk about Malcolm X, talk about Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass. I thought that was really helpful. So with your daughter, maybe you can just do what every other generation, I guess, has done, and just try to keep that flame alive of, giving some insight that the history books don't want to teach. But okay, so he goes on to say, today I see it more as a sort of stand-in for the white evangelical God. And I wanted to highlight here, because I am sort of a literary nerd. You notice he doesn't capitalize evangelical and God in this sense. I think what he's saying there is that this is basically blasphemy, what these people are doing. This isn't something that's ordained from God with a big G. This is something else. So he goes on to say, where some people look to God, capital G, or good deeds to absolve themselves of sin or wrongdoing, white evangelicals have sought and received absolution through the gavel. Assurances that wrongdoing committed in their name is all water under the bridge now. That's right back to that thing. They don't want to address it. They really just want some solution really quickly so they don't have to say white or black ever again. But it's like, we're going to have to talk about race a little bit more, maybe a lot more. So he goes on to say, the social progress we've seen in the United States over the past century, and everything from voting rights, abortion rights, to affirmative action, has repudiated the racist, sexist power structure imposed by white evangelicals that predates our country's founding. He's right on that. He's right on that. Yes, go Miss Lakiva. So Miss Lakiva says, Thomas forgets he is a black man, so he needs to help his race. Yes, I am in complete agreement. Jesus, the same Jesus who they believe permitted slavery in their minds, Christianity in the US, is not what I thought growing up. No, 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 it is not. This is something entirely different. This right here, what they're talking about, is so true though. Like, this evangelical thing that's going on, this corruption, where it's using the name, it's evoking the name of God, it's evoking the name of Jesus, it's talking about the scripture, but yet it's doing the exact opposite of what Jesus would ever want anyone to do, which is separating children from their families, killing, murdering, raping, pillaging. I mean, this is not what the God or the Jesus of my Bible would want anyone to do. This is absolutely reprehensible. And the fact that people are using it in the name, using a sacred name over their bad actions, it is something, as they say, American as apple pie. So now the Supreme Court, it goes on to say, now the Supreme Court is telling Americans that repudiation has gone too far. On Thursday, the Republican appointed justices said that in the name of the 14th Amendment, which was specifically adopted to stem anti-Black racism, affirmative action on college campuses must end. And you know what? I would add in there that this is just the start. It starts with the college campuses, but eventually they're going to try to get into the workplace. They're going to try to get into the military, to the workforce. This is the beginning of the end, if you will. Okay, tea break. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. So It goes on to say, in their longing for colorblindness, a racial neutrality that requires us to ignore the role that race plays in present day systems, pause there. It is so ingrained in everything that we do. You know, we've talked about this on my channel. Black women, Black content creators are the most targeted group on social media. They just get hate like locusts, you know? I look at Dr. Rashad Ritchie, who is amazing. You know, he's right up there with Walter Cronkite. The only difference is he's Black, you know? He's Black and Walter Cronkite was white, you know? But you look in the comments and you see people calling him racist. It's like I said, somebody who was featured, I think, on the Roland Martin channel or MSNBC, they said, you should be very, very scared when you hear a lot of white men talking about racism coming towards them. That is a huge red flag. You know, like race plays a role in everything today. All the stuff that we talk about on this channel, Hollywood losing $10 billion a year. Sorry, not 10 billion. I always say 10 billion. $10 million a year by not embracing diversity. Like, we could just keep going through all of that. That quote I gave you earlier, America's 13% Black. You do not see 13% Black people across executive leadership, even employment in general. The reason that you see, well, actually, there's more whites on the welfare system than Blacks, but the reason there's that narrative out there that Blacks are, you know, fatiguing the welfare system is because if you can't get a job because of your skin color, you can't get a job even when you've got, you know, 3-4 degrees because of your skin color. Like, what do you expect? America is still a racist country. And unless we have things like this in place, we can never be colorblind. That's the goal. To be colorblind is the goal, but we ain't there yet. Okay, I'm going to continue. The 6 conservative justices effectively excused white people from consideration of their privilege and oppressive power. Notably, the justices left in place many end arounds, including priority admissions for children of alumni and donors that overwhelmingly favor white students. It goes on to say, Justice Clarence Thomas, an opponent of affirmative action, who has benefited from race-based preferences in his career, wrote this in his concurring opinion. And we're going to come back to this because I'm coming after this man. It's so weird. His whole career is so weird because he's like, I don't want to be judged for my race. I want to just get the job just to get the job. I don't want anybody to say anything about my race. And meanwhile, most of his career, he's gotten his jobs because of his race. Yes, I know. The Roman Empire, I think about that all the time. Did you guys see the documentary about Cleopatra on Netflix with Julius Caesar? If you hadn't, watch it. But I mean, it's history repeats itself, and it's so absolutely hilarious and sad all at the same time. I hope that America really, really wakes up because it's going to be bad. And, you know, I've said in other videos, we can be sitting here battling one another in the US, meaning races, you know, hetero people versus homosexual people, white people versus Black people, whatever. We can be sitting here fighting these stupid culture wars that are being created by rich right-wing donors who are funding the media, who basically are doing it just because they have nothing else to do and it brings them more money. Or we can get defeated by some really real powers out there. We can either be divided and fail when those things, or if those things happen, if those powers, you know, do those things, or we can be united together and stand as a united front. I mean, we have bigger fish to fry than infighting. And I'm wondering when America is going to figure that out. But anyway, so the quote here from Clarence Thomas is, universities' discriminatory policies burden millions of applicants who are not responsible for the racial discrimination that sullied our nation's past. Pause. Okay, they're not responsible for it, but their ancestors are responsible for it. And the point of a democracy is that we all work together. It is our responsibility, every single American, to rewrite history's wrongs. Otherwise, what the heck do we have a democracy for? Just call it a dictatorship and call it a day. I mean, like, what are you even talking about? Okay, so he goes on to say, whatever their skin color, today's youth simply are not responsible for instituting the segregation of the 20th century, and they do not shoulder the moral debts of their ancestors. We all do, man. What are you talking about? Okay, anyway. So it goes on to say, and Bloomberg reporter Greg Storr noted that Chief Justice John Roberts, a longtime opponent of affirmative action, had satisfied a years-long quest by drafting the majority opinion Thursday. In his opinion, Roberts repeatedly bemoans the continued use of affirmative action at colleges, complaining that no end is in sight for such policies. And he suggests there's no way for a court to know when the perilous remedy of racial preferences may cease. Hold on. Racial preferences. So you're telling me that Black people and brown people, and again, I know that Asians, Hispanics, homosexuals, LGBTQ, disabled, veteran, I know that there's other minority marginalized groups that come to this, but I speak about as a person of color. So I know I'm going to probably keep coming back to Black people, but remember that this is a wide pool. But to think about the fact that Black people literally have been shackled in chains, generations and generations. Here in France, my friends are from Ivory Coast and Cameroon. Like, most of my friends are from Ivory Coast and Cameroon, but I also have friends from Haiti. My therapist is from Jamaica, like people from all over the world, but Black African descent people. And they know their friggin' history. Their history is not slavery. Like, their history didn't just start with slavery, but African Americans have this unique path of where, if we want to go and find out about our history before slavery, like my family, we got to go and do DNA tests. It's not like my friends, from Cameroon or Ivory Coast, where they just know their history because their family were able to live peacefully, even though their skin was darker than some people on this planet. It's like, Black people don't have preferential treatment. And if we didn't have affirmative action, we know that the pale faces, sorry, no offense to anyone, again, my husband's white, but we know the pale faces in America would not actively make that choice on their own. They would not actively go ahead and bring in the Black and brown people into the colleges. We know that, or into the workforce. I even talked to my husband. I asked his opinion about it. He was like, no, same thing. They wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it voluntarily. It's sad, but there's got to be policy in place to make people do the right thing. Anyway, okay. So it goes on to say, it's as if the justices are saying to white people, and white men in particular, you've done enough good for the world. It's time for you to do well for yourself. Oh my goodness. Like, the hilarity. You know what I would add to the end of that sentence is like, it's time for you to do well for yourself, even though you've pretty much always done well for yourself. Okay, moving on. So the article goes on to say, when I think about the kinds of ahistorical affirmations we've seen handed down by the court in recent years on voting rights, abortion rights, and now affirmative action, I'm brought back to the idea of absolution and of repentance. These are difficult things to achieve. They require introspection, self-critique, empathy for people you've harmed, and reparative action. Oh my goodness. It infuriates me too. You know what? This right here is it. This is the bee's knees right here, because when we look at people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, we look at people like Jim Jordan, we look at people like Donald Trump, one of their biggest attributes is that they are unwilling to admit when they've done something wrong. You look at President Obama, which God bless the Obamas, that freaking crazy MAGA extremists who went to their house. This is the type of culture that crazy orange man has introduced into one of the best countries in the world. It's like, oh, Lord, keep them safe. But I mean, the people, these type of far right extremists, they all have in common that they are unwilling to just sit back and be empathetic and be like, oh, okay, I didn't think of it that way. I didn't think of it that way from that perspective. Never. They're never ever going to do that because it's all just a game of numbers with them. It's not about people. It's not about the American people. You can clearly see that. It's just about winning. It's about narcissism. It's about vengeance. It's about vindictiveness. It's childish, really, at its core. When you look at the people who are really, really progressed with their faith, I'm going to compare this a lot with faith because, I mean, that's something that Joe from Morning Joe said at some point. He was like, America has a spiritual drought. We're in a faith drought. And it's true, because when you look at this right here, the people who truly, truly lack faith, people who truly lack faith, who lack self-confidence, who are vindictive, who are narcissistic, they cannot introspect. They can't self-introspect. They can't listen to other perspectives and hear how they're hurting people and try to change their way. In fact, no, it's going to be a fragile bruise to their ego, to their fragile ego, and they'll actually dig their heels in deeper. These people should not be the people in power. If you are a young person, listen to this. If you're, say, under the age of 30, please do not be turned away from learning and knowledge about your political landscape, a bipartisan one that considers Democratic and Republican perspectives. Don't be afraid to be an advocate. It's like, it's up to you guys. Young people, you're the next one. All right, so we'll keep going. It says, these are difficult things to achieve. They require introspection, self-critique, empathy for people you've harmed, and reparative action. And rather than engage earnestly in this hard work, many white evangelicals seem eager to ignore its necessity. And this court will help them. But as Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said in her dissent, willful ignorance of racism only makes the problem more acute. She wrote, oh my God, and I do have to say right here, Ketanji Brown Jackson, I'm totally getting Ruth Bader Ginsburg vibes. Did anybody else get that? Did they feel like she's like some kind of, I don't know, replacement for RBG? Or like maybe maybe they thought they could kill two birds with one stone. They're like, she's a woman, she's Black, we can put a bunch of that in there and people think we're actually making progress. Well, it doesn't really do progress when, you've got 6 Republicans and 3 Democrats. But anyway, go Yalibi. So Yalibi says, all these racist policies will backfire. Look at Florida. This is not going to end well if they do not stop. The Christians movement is only Christian in name. We have a very large amount of evil. I am in complete agreement. Complete. Sorry. So Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson said, well, with let them eat cake obliviousness, today the majority pulls the ripcord and announces colorblindness for all by legal fiat. But deeming race irrelevant in law does not make it so in life. Yes, girl, you go. It is no small irony that the judgment the majority hands down today will forestall the end of race-based disparities in this country, making the colorblind world the majority wistfully toots much more difficult to accomplish. I love this woman. I don't even know much about this woman, but just reading that, because, the let them eat cake, Marie Antoinette was the one who said that. And basically, it was to point at how naive she was. That's a quote that's cited from her very, very often from scholars because, and she eventually got executed. She was an Austrian child bride queen who ruled over France, and they got executed. There was civil unrest because people were starving and hungry, and there was chaos and culture wars happening. Sounds familiar, right? And all the while she was naively sitting there while people were barely able to feed their children, and she's like, "Oh, well, let them eat cake." It's like, girl, they can't afford cake. What are you talking about? That's where this is coming from. It's like the naivety, all the naivety to think, oh, well, people shouldn't be judged for what their ancestors did. We live in a colorblind society. It's like, oh my God. So Jahan goes on to say, at some level, I pity the white evangelicals who keep returning to the court, wanting it to affirm their 19th century worldview. I love this guy because it's so true. I look at these MAGA extremists, especially with the chick who came to the Supreme Court back in 2014 or whatever, 2019, whatever it was, saying, I shouldn't be judged on what my ancestors did. She just seems like a plant for whoever her super far right conservative family members are, even if she doesn't realize it. But we're going to take a look at that. So, people who seek absolution but with souls so barren will never get it from any God worth a damn. So Clarence Thomas and Samuel Alito, and Samuel Alito is Republican as well, will apparently have to do. As I prepared for this ruling to come down, I wanted to learn more about the intersection of race and religion, specifically people of faith who subscribe to beliefs that compel them to do good. I wanted to share some words from Abraham Heschel, the rabbi and civil rights activist that really struck a chord with me. He said in a speech in 1963, "It is not within the power of God to forgive the sins committed toward men. We must first ask for forgiveness of those whom our society has wronged before asking for the forgiveness of God. Daily, we patronize institutions which are visible manifestations of arrogance towards those whose skin differs from ours. Daily, we cooperate with people who are guilty of active discrimination. How long will I continue to be tolerant of, even a participant in, acts of embarrassing and humiliating human beings in restaurants, hotels, buses or parks, employment agencies, public schools, and universities? One ought rather be ashamed than put others to shame." And you know what? When I read stuff like this, because I am a little bit of a bookworm, when I read stuff like this is from the 1960s, but I've read stuff like this, y'all, from the 18th century, and it sounds like it could be said today. Like when you look at this, especially when he's talking about in restaurants, hotels, buses, parks. I mean, how many of us have seen an utter Karen, or Ken just going crazy in a hotel, bus, or park? Or who's seen an injustice towards a person of color or a LGBTQ person or a woman in public, and you just thought for a second like you had been transported back to the Middle Ages? You're like, what the heck is going on? When I look at literature like this, it's like, gosh, this really could have been written today. So this next article is from Slate. This is more of a focus on Clarence Thomas, because I gotta get to figure out why this man hates Black people so much and why he seems to be hating himself. So let's take a look at this. If you're watching this after, please put your thoughts in the comments. So this is from Slate. This is by Joel Anderson, and this is from June 29th, 2023. And it starts on Thursday. The Supreme Court effectively struck down affirmative action, outlawing race-conscious admissions and overturning nearly 50 years of precedent. While John Roberts authored the opinion, Clarence Thomas wrote his own concurrence with the decision. At his Supreme Court confirmation hearing in 1991, Clarence Thomas said that affirmative action can undermine the self-esteem and self-respect of the people it's supposedly helping. So that day that I'm pausing here, this is natural talking. That day that Clarence Thomas had that confirmation hearing, he had already gotten race-based preferences. Like, that was basically what got him to where he was that day. Even if people come up in here and say, oh, well, that technically was an affirmative action. It was race-based preferences. And you're going to hear it at one point in here. It's going to be very, very clear. But, you know, this also shows that this guy is bonkers. I mean, he's had a grudge to wedge for so long. He and his wealthy Republican donors, and one in particular, have been tinkering away at this issue very clearly for a very, very, very long time. And he's hurt thousands and thousands of Black people in the process. Okay, so we keep going. On that day, Thomas sat before the U.S. Senate, having accumulated decades of achievement and having benefited from race-based preferences every step of his way. Thomas, who went to college in the late 1960s, was part of the first generation of Black Americans who came of age in the affirmative action era. Let me pause there. Do y'all know that this dude was wearing leather jackets and an afro and marching and looking like a Black Panther? It's just insane how people will flip-flop. So Thomas, who went to college in the late 1960s, was a part of the first generation of Black Americans who came of age in the affirmative action era. John F. Kennedy was the first president to call for affirmative action in the modern sense of the term. His successor, Lyndon Johnson, tried to make that bold idea into the law of the land. You know, people can argue that Lyndon Johnson had some ulterior motives with this, but at the end of the day, I think he saw that this was what where America was at. I think he clearly saw that this is basically where we need to go. We can't house all of these people in this country and only have the majority of the people being functioning parts of society. You know, it just doesn't work. It's not sustainable. So, but Johnson's affirmative action proposal was mired in controversy and ultimately got scrapped. This reminds me of the 1619 Project with Lord Dunmire, or whatever whatever his name was, where he wanted to free the slaves in Virginia, and all the wealthy, you know, European transplants were like, "Ah, we're gonna melt, we're gonna melt." So the concept was then revived under a Republican president, Richard Nixon. One of the main proponents of positive discrimination was Nixon's Assistant Secretary of Labor. He was a Black Republican named Arthur Fletcher. He's known as the father of affirmative action. Fletcher, who in 1950 became the first Black player for the NFL's Baltimore Colts. It's so funny now that the NFL is like pretty much fully Black, but they're not making the most money. It's actually the coaches who are and the team owners who are, and they are not majority Black. Who would have thunk it? But affirmative action wouldn't be limited to the public sector. Private organizations see the writing on the wall and begin to institute their own version of affirmative action, said Leah Wright Rigger, a history professor at Johns Hopkins University. Among those private organizations were institutions of higher learning. Thomas enrolled at the College of the Holy Cross. This one was a big one. You know, the fact that he even made it to Holy Cross was a big deal. In 1968, as a second-year transfer, he got admitted thanks to his good grades and a recommendation from a nun, and maybe in part because the school was actively looking for Black students. And there's really no maybe in the fact. I've done other research. It's basically because he was Black. 3 years later, in 1971, he got accepted to multiple law schools. One of them was Harvard, which had just adopted a race-conscious admissions policy. Thomas had once fantasized about going to Harvard Law, but when it came time to choose, he decided on Yale because he thought it would be a better place to fit his liberal politics. My cousin went to Yale. Thomas arrived at Yale at the exact moment it created its first explicit affirmative action program. It was designed to set minority enrollment at about 10% of the incoming class. During his Supreme Court confirmation hearing, Thomas said that he believed he'd earned his spot at Yale and hadn't received any special treatment due to his race. What Thomas said in 1991 isn't wrong. Yale did open its doors to minority students that it felt were qualified. But the New York Times reporting that same year uncovered the whole truth. Yale did evaluate Black applicants like Thomas separately, and they did get special consideration. So it's not affirmative action in so many words, but it's basically affirmative action, Clarence. Like the self-hate is so weird. It's so weird. It's like, dude, you should be proud that you're Black. You should be proud that you're getting some preference because your ancestors were slaves. You should be proud of that fact. You should be proud that you have gotten this advantage when you know so many others who look like you, who might have the same background, don't have that. The self-hate here is so insidious. I hope that we're teaching like our young children to love themselves, to recognize that they're beautiful just the way that they are. Thomas was one of the 12 Black students in the first year's class of 175. Yale had a reputation as a proving ground for the academic elite, a place that counted 7 Supreme Court justices among its former students. That is pretty insane. There's been, 100? That's pretty crazy. And when Thomas got there, he started to question whether he belonged. Okay, let's hear it. So all these racist policies will backfire. Look at Florida. Oh, well, yes, we saw this one. Yes, they will backfire. So let's go on to the next page. So most days he would get up before dawn, go to class, and study until he fell asleep. He also worked 15 hours a week at a legal clinic. Now, I just want to say here, like, Clarence Thomas is like who was it? Oh gosh, I was watching someone the other day. What is it? Hardball? One of the hosts from MSNBC was basically saying Clarence Thomas could possibly, absolutely be considered one of the most intelligent, influential legal Black minds of this day and age. And like, it's true. We can see that the guy is really, really intelligent. We can see that he's worked really hard. That doesn't mean that you don't hate yourself. Okay. So Yalibi says, affirmative action does not exclude academic performance. It just opens the door for the same academic performance to be acknowledged and accepted. That's so true, and I'm really glad that you highlight that, because I feel like a lot of people feel like, oh, these people who are underqualified are getting the same, advantages, and it's just not true. Okay, so, but no matter how hard he tried, it didn't feel like it would ever be good enough. During his time at Yale, a member of the law school's admission committee told a group of Black students that none of them were qualified to be there. Oh, dang. As Thomas continued at Yale, he started scouting out job opportunities. During his last year, he interviewed with some big city firms and figured he'd get a bunch of lucrative job offers. All right, so let's see how this turns out. But as his classmates zoomed off to start their careers, Thomas heard no after no after no. I wonder why that is. Years later, he said in an interview that he'd held on to all of those rejection letters. This guy is a friggin' masochist. You like, oh my God. Okay. Thomas suspected. Yes, agreed. Thomas suspected that those top law firms doubted his qualifications. What good was a Yale law degree if everyone who mattered thought it was tainted by affirmative action? Oh, and he's so misguided because he actually thinks preferential treatment of him being Black is what got him all those rejection letters. But it's not, Clarence. It's because you're Black. That's why affirmative action is so important. It's like, dude, who was guiding this guy through his career? Like, did he not have like a strong Black mom in his life telling him to stay woke or something? Like, my mom's always telling me to stay woke. Who the heck was telling Clarence to stay woke? Exactly. They did not want a Black person. Okay, so what good was a Yale law degree if everyone who mattered thought it was tainted by affirmative action? After Thomas finished up in New Haven, he stuck a 15-cent cigar sticker on his diploma. To him, that's all it was worth. Oh my, I told you this guy's a masochist. When Thomas did finally get a job, however, it was at least in part because of his race. You know, like, even when I look at his face, he gives me serious Igor vibes. Like, is it just me? You guys remember Igor from what show was that? Winnie the Pooh? He just has sad old man eyes. It's like, dude, like, you've sucked your own spirit out of your life by trying so hard to pretend that you're not Black. Anyway, okay. So that's what his political mentor, John Danford, who was then the Attorney General of Missouri, told me. My ambition was that the AG's office was to be the best law office in the state. Did I also think that it was important to have a diverse office? Yes, I did, said Danford, who later became a U.S. Senator. And did I think that it was important that it would be wonderful to hire Clarence Thomas for that reason? Yes. You see right here what John Danford is saying. Yes, we hired him because he was Black. Incidentally, before the Supreme Court's decision today, Danford also told me that affirmative action should be upheld. He says, I think that slavery and Jim Crow are serious stains on our country, and the consequences can be measured in life expectancy, health care, wealth, income, transportation, housing. This is stuff that Black people have always known. But when a white person said it, it's like, ooh, oh, ooh, it's like, dude, we've been talking about this for forever. That's why we protest so much. It's like we've been talking about this for a very, very long time. Statistically, African Americans are not doing as well as the rest of us, he said. I believe that when a problem exists, it should be addressed affirmatively. The article goes on to say Thomas would eventually leave Danford's office for Monsanto. At the time when the chemical company was looking to hire a Black lawyer. He'd then go to work for Danford in Washington, D.C., when the new senator was looking to diversify his staff. After that, he'd get a job at Reagan's Department of Education, one that Thomas believed he'd been offered only because he was Black. Such Igor vibes. Okay. He then became the chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. You know what? The other thing is, like, when do we get to the point where Clarence is like, thank God, I need to get down on my knees and thank God every day for blessing me with the opportunities that I have? When do we get that? All I hear him saying is, oh, he got this because I'm Black. It's just like, okay, let me stop clowning. It's ironic. It's so weird. Okay, I'm done. I'm not going to clown. Okay. So, he then became the chairman of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a position that 6 Black women had turned down before Thomas accepted it. From there, he was nominated to a federal judgeship by President George H.W. Bush, and then to the Supreme Court. As I've said many times, I think we would kill, and metaphorically kill. We're not MAGA extremists or January 6th peaceful protesters. But I definitely do think that we kill, metaphorically, for like a George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, anything like that at this point right now. Anything other than Donald Trump or Ron DeSantis. And then to the Supreme Court. Of course, every job he'd ever gotten was because he was Black. His former girlfriend, Lillian McEwen, a retired administrative law judge at the Securities and Exchange Commission, told me that was his whole life. Like, dude, this right here tells you everything that you need to know. This guy hates being Black, but it's why he's where he's at right now. Can you imagine what kind of a life is that to live? That means he essentially hates his whole essence. He hates his whole anthology. This is like sad, and it's not only sad, it's hurting thousands of African Americans. It's not just hurting Thomas, it's hurting other African Americans. So, anyway, I grew up in the affirmative action era too, albeit a generation later than Clarence Thomas. Still, when I went to high school and college in the 1990s, I heard the same stuff Thomas heard about how I was only there because of affirmative action. It was a familiar refrain, one that I knew didn't have much to do with me or my academic qualifications. I gradually came to understand that the white people who said that to me would never believe I was qualified, no matter what. But you know what? Those people would never believe you were qualified, whether you were there through affirmative action or not, because those people are just bigots. Okay, wrapping up with this one. But Thomas apparently has taken those insults much more personally. He has. He's a masochist. Juan Williams, his friend, a former Washington Post reporter, saw that frustration up close. In 1986, Thomas was sworn in for his second term as chairman of the EEOC. Several high-ranking members of the Reagan administration were there, including William Bradford Reynolds, a white official from the Department of Justice. Reynolds raised his glass for a toast and said, "Clarence Thomas is the epitome of the right kind of affirmative action working the right way." And Thomas just seethes over this comment, because I can tell you he has never seen himself as an example of affirmative action. Williams told me he's seen himself as having earned and worked hard to achieve advancement. Williams remembered it as a pained response, This ish never stops with white people. Oh, Lord, that ending there. Okay, so this basically goes into, I guess, that's like some sort of podcast or something. Listen to Slow Burn, Becoming Justice Thomas. But we basically see where that kind of ends up, okay? It doesn't work. So for those of you who might be watching now, watching after, whatever it might be, you might be younger, you might be a little bit younger than me, you might be Gen Z, or even older people. Maybe you might not know it, but I did want to talk a little bit about the history of affirmative action, because everything in our schools, in the U.S. school system right now, it's really not the school system that I grew up in. It's different, and they're whitewashing stuff. Go, Yalibi. So, wit is not hurting him. Wit was wit. He disassociated himself with the Black community. In a twisted way, he thinks that he is white. Marrying a white woman was part of his plan to become what he aspired to. Dude, I married a white man, but I didn't lose all of my friggin' culture and background. It's like, what is wrong with this man? Yes, yeah. It doesn't mean he doesn't love her, but she's a part of his plan. That's scary to think about. I just think some people they're not responsible with interracial relationships. It's like, I get why those movies, like, what was that movie with Bernie Mac and Ashton Kutcher and Zoe Saldana, where she brings home the white boyfriend and they're getting married and stuff. And that was one of the first movies that was kind of like, I guess, early 2000s version of what's the one on Netflix? I think it's called Black People, or the one with Eddie Murphy. But anyway, there's been a wave of movies and TV shows like that, with interracial couples, and it just became a trendy thing to do. But I would say, as someone married to a white dude, it's like, please don't marry someone outside of your race to marry someone outside of your race. Like, if that's your motivation, maybe you should rethink that. Like, marry someone for love. But I don't know. Okay, so this is an article from KQED, which I love. KQED is, I think, public radio, and I think it's the one in Berkeley. Don't quote me on that. I think it's out of California. And this is an article called Timeline, A Heated History of Affirmative Action in America. And this is by Matthew Green. Guess who's coming to dinner? Yes! That is it. Oh my God, yes. Nostalgic vibes. Okay, so the heated history of affirmative action in America. So this is from 1954 to 2023. If you can, check out this article because it was cool. And even below this area, it was like a slideshow. Below it, it had like a timeline, an interactive timeline when you could actually see everything kind of all mapped out. It was pretty cool. So it says the heated history of affirmative action in America. We'll go through this history and then we'll wrap up. I think we'll also wrap up in prayer in this one as well. We wrapped up on our Sussex live stream in prayer yesterday. I think we're going to need prayer on this one too. So for more than half a century, Americans have battled over the constitutionality and ethics of the affirmative action policies used by schools and employers to increase diversity. Scroll through this timeline of landmark moments in history of a perennially divisive issue. In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court discredits the concept of separate but equal. This is Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, by the way. Ruling that segregation in public schools violates the Equal Protection Clause under the 14th Amendment. The decision is vehemently opposed by segregationists, and it takes years before many segregated schools in the South are forced to integrate. Now, I'm from the American South. I think that the South, America had to do so much to pull the South up with the rest of the country. There was so much hate and anger. You look at the KKK, you look at all of those killings that happened with the people who were trying to advocate for Black people to vote, to go to school. You look at the church burnings. I mean, horrible, horrendous stuff. And there was so much effort that had to go in to really pull the South up with the rest of the country. And I feel like that struggle right there, that is like our badge of honor. That is what the rest of the world, even especially Europe. I mean, Europe they're such fanboys for the story of the people like the Martin Luther King Jr.'s because it is something that is uniquely American. It's a very sad element and attribute of our country, but it's something that's uniquely American. This overturning of affirmative action just takes us decades back. Why don't they understand that? So the decision is vehemently opposed, and the South is basically forced to integrate. So basically, government has to intervene to enforce these laws. So 1961, JFK, my side boo. Guys, isn't it weird? But like when I was younger, I had like a crush on JFK. Is that just me? I don't know why, but he just had some sort of swagger that like, I don't know, 7 or 8-year-old me was just like, oh my God. I don't know. So 1961, JFK references affirmative action. And I think he's actually the first one to kind of term that. He's like the one to token that term. President John F. Kennedy issues an executive order mandating that projects financed with federal funds take affirmative action to ensure that there is no racial bias in hiring and employment practices. And then LBJ. So 1964, there's the Civil Rights Act. President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the most sweeping bad boy vibes. President Lyndon B. And apparently Marilyn was into those bad boy vibes too. She was into those bad boy vibes double time. All right, let me not get on Marilyn. I don't want to evoke her name with anything negative because I think that she was awesome. She was such a Betty. President Lyndon B. Johnson signs the most sweeping piece of civil rights legislation since Reconstruction. The new law prohibits discrimination in various settings, including hotels, schools, and government services. It prevents employers, labor unions, and employment agencies from excluding applicants and customers on the basis of race, sex, color, religion, or national origin. A commission is established to enforce the law. And then 1965, I look at pictures and videos like this and I just think of my mom. Like, I think of my mom because I was born in Birmingham, Alabama, really small town in Birmingham, Alabama, and my mom told me about when she was like 15 years old and she was so skinny. Like she had, when I look at pictures of her, she just had that really big 1960s hair. The pictures are black and white and she's got these little knobby knees, but she has, I mean, she's always been like someone who's so outspoken. So I just look at her tiny body, but I also think about how how her personality was. And I'm like, oh my, and she got on a bus one day in Birmingham, Alabama, and she was 15 at the time. So this would have been the late 60s, the mid 60s, late 60s. And this old fat white man got on the bus. He had a cane and he hit her chair, like started beating her chair and told her, "Get up, gal, get up, gal." And I remember hearing that story as a kid and just thinking, what? Like, how? I don't understand. But anyway, and anytime I see these photos like this, I think about my mom and dad boogieing back in the 1960s and 70s and fighting for us. It's like their generation is the reason that my generation actually affords so many of the privileges that we have. And I think now it's time for my generation to realize that we got to do the same thing for the next. One of the reasons that Donald Trump got in office is because we did not vote. Young people didn't vote. So hopefully now we see what the world looks like when we don't vote and we don't advocate for ourselves. So 1965, defining affirmative action in a graduation speech at Howard University, a historically Black college, President Johnson insists it is not enough to just have laws that prohibit discrimination. I really encourage you to watch this video if you can of his speech. It was really good. Arguing that more proactive measures are necessary. Quote, "You do not take a man who for years has been hobbled by chains, liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, saying you are free to compete with all the others." End quote. Oh, I'm sorry, no. "And still justly believe you have been completely fair," end quote, he said. Later that year, Johnson issues a new executive order requiring government contractors to take affirmative action to ensure racial equality in hiring and employment. Now, 1978, and I know this seems like it's going back so far, but when I said, dude, this ruling on affirmative action is unraveling decades of work. I mean, oh, Clarence. So in 1978, racial quotas at University of California are struck down. And I know it seems like I'm harping on about Clarence Thomas. There are others in there that made the decision. But I do know that this has been a grudge that he's had for a very long time. So I know that he's at the center of having pushed this. And I mean, not to sound bigoted, we got to talk about race to get to the bottom of racism. Those other white guys and the one white Republican woman in there, they would have tried to get this stuff out anyway because the right has always had a problem with affirmative action. So 1978, racial quotas of University of California struck down. In Regents of the University of California versus Bake, the U.S. Supreme Court strikes down a UC policy that reserved admission slots for minority applicants, ruling it a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The court says UC can continue to consider race and ethnicity as a factor in the admission decision as long as it doesn't have specific quotas in place. The case originated when Alan Bake, a 33-year-old white student, was twice rejected from UC Davis Medical School, filed suit claiming it was unfair that minority applicants with lower academic standing were accepted over him. Now, something else about white privilege that white people, especially white supremacists, are not going to want to hear is that they really aren't good at the colonizers' game that they've inflicted on Black people for a very long time. Those expressions like try again, or how do you say it? It's like, Um, if you don't succeed at first, try again, or something like that. Black people, brown people, marginalized groups have basically always had to do that. Like when I applied for university, I basically knew I was going in as another Black person, another woman. And so I probably was not going to get some amazing preferential treatment. So I applied to 5 or 6 college. I applied to 5 or 6 universities, and the application fees were not cheap, but it was what I had to do. And I knew that if I got rejected by some of them, I wasn't going to be able to just say, oh, I give up. I'm not going to pursue my career in advertising because this one university rejected me, when I actually was kind of like at a bigger place in my career, and I was getting more recognized, and there was these job opportunities at hand, and I wanted to have something better, and I would go and apply for these more senior roles. I had to be prepared to be rejected, because that's just what happens when you have a uterus, and also when you're Black or when you're brown. It's just a given. And so we've been like taught to just try and keep your spirit up. You just got to keep going, for keeping your eyes on the prize, keep going. And the way that, we've seen all these incel and men's rights and domestic terrorist groups pop up, because that one slight, threat to that privilege of like, nope, you can just apply to the one university you want to go to and you'll get accepted. The fact that that's like, threatened, oh my God, this opens up the floodgates of friggin' Armageddon. It's like, guys, you have to be, I feel like, whites in America are finally getting to live through those shoes that Blacks in America have always had to. It's like, guys, you got to be resilient, apply to a bunch of different schools. And if you get rejected, keep trying. Like, don't let this knock you down. Maybe a lot of, the majority could take some note from the minorities who have always had to face adversity. And yet, when life has knocked them down in the dirt and gotten them dirty and messy, and they've had to get back up, maybe it's time that the majority learns how to do that. It's a very good life skill. So anyway, 1982, racial hiring quotas mandated for Alabama State Police. I told y'all I'm from Alabama. It's one of the South. It's the heart of Dixie. It's called the heart of Dixie for a reason. In 1970, a federal court ordered the Alabama Department of Public Safety, which hadn't hired a single Black patrol officer in its 37-year history. What the friggin' heck? To end pervasive, systematic, and obstinate discriminatory exclusion of Blacks. By 1982, after the department had failed to promote any Black employees above entry-level positions, I told you, this is why affirmative action is important. It's like, if affirmative action, if policy isn't put in place to make companies do it, to make universities be diverse, they just won't do it, especially in the South. To end perversive, systematic, and obstinate discriminatory exclusion of Blacks. By 1982, after the department had failed to promote any Black employees above entry-level positions, the court orders a racial quota system to be put in place until at least a quarter of the department's upper ranks are minorities. The U.S. Supreme Court in 1987 upholds the quota system, ruling it necessary in light of the department's overt history of discrimination. I can just hear the begrundled fumbles and grumbles of just like, we don't want this. So, March 1996, UT Law School's affirmative action policy struck down. So, of course, this is in Texas. Like, I'm really not lying when I'm saying the American South, they had to be pulled up by the bootstraps to get them to come up with the rest of the country. In Hopwood versus Texas, a federal court rules that the school's policy of lower admission thresholds for minority applicants is unconstitutional. The court rejects the defense's argument that a diverse student body is a compelling interest. That was a loss. So November 1996, California voters approve affirmative action ban. Voters approved Prop 209, which amends the state's constitution and prohibits state institutions, including public universities, from considering race, sex, or ethnicity in admissions and hiring decisions. A federal district judge initially blocks enforcement of the proposition, but an appeals court overturns that ruling and allows the measure to proceed. It has since survived numerous legal challenges. Meanwhile, Black and Hispanic enrollment in the UC system dropped significantly after the ban took effect in 1998. Since then, 8 other states have passed similar affirmative action bans, including Arizona, Florida, Idaho, Michigan, Nebraska, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, and Washington. Why don't those states surprise me? I mean, that must be Washington State because, I mean, yeah, that doesn't surprise me. And you know what? When you look at all of the stuff that's always going on the TV about California and the gang activity, this and that, oh, Compton, LA, et cetera, et cetera. Well, what has the state of California really been doing to help those disparate communities? I mean, I do know that on a level, California has a great welfare system. It has great health care. Like, I mean, it's more progressive. Okay, we get it. Climate change, it's the EPA and all of that. But dude, this wasn't good. And you really can see those roots of Jim Crow that's been clawing at this for a very long time. I mean, you can imagine they were begrundled with this back in the 60s. So this was a slow burning fuse to just slowly chip away at affirmative action. So in 2003, split rulings of University of Michigan's admissions policies, almost done here. Michigan's admissions, say that 50 times fast. The U.S. Supreme Court rejects the university's undergraduate admissions policy of awarding points to minority applicants, arguing that it's too similar to a quota system. And people are really caught up on this quota thing. I think people just get caught up on the wrong things. But in a separate ruling, the court upholds the law school's policy of considering an applicant's race in admissions decisions, which it deems a compelling interest. However, 3 years later, Michigan voters approve a statewide affirmative action ban that effectively invalidates the law school's policy. You see, they've just been chipping away at it. Almost done here. So 2014, a court upholds Michigan's voter-approved affirmative action ban. Oh, Lord, I really hope that those abortion bans don't end up like this. I mean, this is just so bizarre. In a major blow to affirmative action policies nationwide, the U.S. Supreme Court upholds a 2006 Michigan voter-approved ban on race-conscious admissions policies in public universities. The court argues that state voters should have the authority to determine this issue on their own without the court intervening. While the decision doesn't outlaw affirmative action policies in schools outside of Michigan, it gives other states the green light to do so. In her impassioned dissent, Justice Sonia Sotomayor argues that a decision unconstitutionally infringes on the rights of minorities. Thank you. Thank you, Justice Sotomayor. So 2016, High Court narrowly upholds at Austin's race-conscious admissions policies. So after her rejection from the University of Texas at Austin in 2008, Abigail Fisher, a white honor student, claimed she was unfairly denied admission because of her race. So she couldn't just pick herself up by the bootstraps and keep on moving, be resilient and continue to follow her dreams, follow her goals, continue to apply to other places, the same way that, minorities going after higher education have basically always had to do in the history of the United States. She couldn't do that. She couldn't do that at all. That absolutely wasn't a choice for her. A federal court upheld the school's race-conscious admissions policy. But in 2013, the U.S. Supreme Court sent the case back to the lower court for further review. In 2016, the High Court again takes up the challenge to the university's affirmative action policy, this time narrowly upholding it in a 4-3 decision, with now retired Justice Anthony Kennedy casting the deciding vote. And lastly, we've come to the end. U.S. Supreme Court rejects affirmative action in college admissions, 2023. This right here just seems like the apocalypse. This seems like the apocalypse. In a historic 6-3 decision, the court's conservative majority struck down affirmative action admissions policy at Harvard and the University of North Carolina, effectively barring all public and private colleges from considering race in admissions decisions. Writing for the majority, Chief Justice John Roberts said considering an applicant's race cannot be reconciled with the guarantees of the Equal Protection Clause. Although he noted that the decision doesn't prevent universities from considering an applicant's discussion of how race affected his or her life. In a scathing dissent read from the bench, Justice Sonia Sotomayor accused the majority of further entrenching racial inequality in education, the very foundation of our democratic government and pluralistic society. This is so sad, guys. This is so sad, but at the same time, it just further highlights how important right now advocacy is. Run to Satan wants to kill woke. There is definitely a reason why these far right people want to kill woke. They want you to be asleep. They quite literally want people to be asleep. And right now, one of our only hopes is young people. Please, young people, get out there and vote. Vote blue. Please vote, 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 vote blue. I can't say it too many times, but I'm going to close it out in prayer. And if you are watching this afterward, if you want to put your prayers or your thoughts, any objectives that you might have in the comments, I totally welcome you to do that in the chat, however you want to do it. You can close your eyes. You can keep your eyes open, however you feel. Lord, we want to thank you for bringing us here today. From wherever we are, all over the world, different races, whether we be American, whether we be from the South of America, from the North, from the West, from the East, it doesn't matter. We come here today to ask that all people be treated with love and compassion, the way that you showed us in the scripture. When you walk this earth, Lord, and I want to speak to people of any race, any faith doctrine, even atheists, I do think that there's wisdom that could be found in the word. But Lord, when you walk this earth, there were injustices. There were people persecuting other people because of their beliefs, because of their appearances, because of their genders, because of what they looked like. There was chaos, but you brought onto the earth a search for love and compassion amongst brothers and sisters. We're constantly searching for that compassion amongst brothers and sisters, Lord, some more than others. This overturning of affirmative action has hurt so many people, the same way that slavery and bigotry and discrimination and misogyny and homophobia and xenophobia has hurt so many people. But something that can redeem us is that love, Lord, that you brought when you walked this earth. And we just pray that you can bring some of that love back into the United States of America. to have the confidence to recognize those stains of our past and have the courage to do something to heal them. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So we'll leave it there, guys. Yalibi says Ron DeSantis would never be president. Mark my word. I really, really, really hope that you're right. I really hope that you're right. At some point, I had thought maybe he could be a good alternative to Donald Trump. But the more I see, I mean, that LGBTQ commercial, I need to do a video about that. It just is so bizarre. But you know what, guys? We're going to keep praying. We're going to keep advocating. We're going to keep raging against the machine. And we will be unstoppable. So again, if you're watching this hereafter, put your thoughts in the comments, put your prayers. I'll leave the chat open for a moment for anybody to put any prayers, any thoughts, any last thoughts they have. And I will see you guys in the next video. If you're new here, don't forget to like and subscribe. Hit the bell so you know whenever I post a video. Oh, yes, absolutely. Definitely. You can totally ask me about Portugal. I don't know much. I've been there about 3 times. So my husband would know a lot more. But I can definitely we can make it work. Like I can be a proxy to him. Like you can ask the questions and then I'll go and ask him. But okay guys. Well, we'll end it there. Don't forget to hit the like and subscribe button, hit the bell. See you guys next time. Bye.